Hi, I'm John from Electronic Audio Experiments. I'm making this video because exactly 10 years ago today, we released a pedal called the Longsword. Now, if you're here, you've probably seen or heard of this pedal, and you might even own one. But if you're new, the Longsword is an op-amp overdrive with a clear voice, a really burly low-mid presence, and a powerful 3-band EQ. It's the first thing that I ever designed from scratch. It's the first EAE pedal, and honestly, we're just shocked and flattered that we're still able to make it and that people are still into it. So it came into existence before we had any real media, anything. So I thought this anniversary would be a great occasion to tell the story of this pedal. So I'm going to talk about where it came from, a little bit about how the design evolved over the years. And finally, I'm going to share some tips for how I personally like to use it. So before we dive in, we celebrated the anniversary with these special edition anniversary longswords. For these, we remixed the original graphics on one of the older versions, and we took the powder coat that's this like metallic purple inspired by the very first V1 run. These are available on our website while supplies last. I really like this color, so there's a decent chance we'll make some purple ones, but this particular art variation is going to be a one-time thing. So let's set the stage. Many times I've talked about how getting into pedals was like my escape from electrical engineering grad school, and it was nice having an outlet where I could explore those ideas in a much lower stakes context. That being said, some nice folks from my university have already made a video where I got to talk about that angle of the story. I'll link it in the description. In many ways, the Longsword story is the EAE story, but the part I haven't talked as much about is like the musical context from which this pedal came about. And I do think that's a really big part of the story. And as we've kind of grown, we've gotten further afield from these like niche genre origins in a cool way. And I love that this pedal has broken free of those pre-existing tethers, but it did come from somewhere. From about 2010 to 2015, I played in a couple of bands in the Northeast DIY, like punk, hardcore, emo, whatever you want to call it scene. I don't even know if you can really put a genre label on it. We just called it DIY. It was like this primordial soup from which bands emerged and collapsed and reemerged, and it generated a lot of weekend tours and 7-inch records. It was a really energizing time, but it also launched all these careers in audio engineering and booking and management, record labels, really you name it. My bands mostly flew under the radar, which meant we could do our thing without looking to impress anyone other than hopefully ourselves. I had been into pedals pretty much since the first time I picked up the electric guitar. It was really like my draw to the instrument. And so I appreciated having an outlet to channel that really just like fanatical special interest that I had. And I also really enjoyed the process of making a good sound, whether it was in a VFW hall or in a friend's recording studio. And I bonded with folks who felt similarly and made a lot of friends in other bands as a result. So to provide some additional context, the bands that I was in sounded like this. Or they sounded like maybe this. Or maybe even this. When it came to guitar sounds, we were going for heaviness, but not in like a traditional metal sense. We wanted impact without the traditional calling cards of high gain. And so a lot of this sound came from drive pedals and old single channel tube amps, partly because those were the amps you could get for cheap on Craigslist, and partly because we grew to love how they sounded. A particular favorite of mine from that era is the Ampeg V4. It's my favorite vintage amp for a lot of reasons, not least of all being that it's a phenomenal pedal platform with a great EQ and crushing volume on tap if you want it. Here's an example of what that sounds like. I generally used a Jazzmaster, though mine has been quite heavily modified since those days. Here's a clip. I rotated through quite a few drive pedals over the years, and I'm going to talk about some of the ones that stuck with me because they were quite influential on the Longsword. One was the Boss HM2, which obviously has some stereotypical associations, but there are a few settings where it produces a solid, straightforward distortion that cuts really effectively through a mix, like this. And eventually, I came across Caroline Wave Cannon. This is the exact unit that I performed and toured with for a few years. I remember still seeing Andy Martin's demo on Pro Guitar Shop and buying my own at Mr. Music in Allston, Mass. I pretty much immediately installed that momentary foot switch for the Havoc function. And honestly, I don't think any pedal in my collection has had as much live play as that Wave Cannon. Here's an example of that on a recording. So eventually the bands calmed down a bit and I found myself in my first year of grad school. During that year in 2015, Boston got over 100 inches of snow. So I found myself stuck at home with time to experiment and hone my craft. And sure enough, ideas began to emerge. I knew I loved op-amp distortions like the HM2 or the Wave Cannon. I knew I loved the shelving filters and active mid-range of the V4. So I wanted to be able to apply that EQ separately to my clean and distorted tones, especially so that I could let the amp maybe play in a space where it wasn't as flattering on its own. The Longsword name came about because, I obviously love fantasy, but it was sort of like a pun about cutting through the mix, but it did stick. With the help of Nick from Dunwich Amps, who was an immense help and a mentor to me in those early days, I was able to design the first PCB. And it barely worked, but at that point I was in deep. Here's an old video that I pulled up from that time. In June of that year, I opened pre-orders for 15 build slots of what we now call Longsword V1. Somehow, despite an incredibly goofy Sharpie marker paint job, they all sold. In fact, I did not even keep one, which is a trend that would continue because anytime I had a prototype or an early rev pedal that was collecting dust, back then I would sell it for rent money. Yeah. Pretty much immediately, the Longsword became my test subject for design updates. Anytime my skills improved or my tastes evolved, we got a new Longsword. And so the result is that there are quite a few versions floating around from those early days. The V1s were a nightmare to build. So by late 2015, I had version 2, which was a more intentional form factor and designed for professional enclosure drilling and printing, which was a big deal at the time. That is also the origin of the line art Longsword graphic, which I designed in a CAD program. Version 2 also had a second foot switch to go between two preset gain values, so you could have high gain on tap all the time. That evolved into the mid-focused boost circuit that we find on V3 and later on. V3 came out in 2017, featuring a graphics overhaul from Zach Weeks for the fonts and layout, and Thomas Serra for the sword drawing. Those early days had a ton of variation because we were always experimenting with clipping diodes and the op-amp selection or nudging EQ points up and down. By version 4, which came out in 2018, we more or less standardized the design. That's also when we moved the boost knob to the outside. I think that having other dirt pedals in our lineup helped clarify its identity and just let it stay in its own lane and be what it was good at. And I think that really did a lot of favors for the design. Version 4 was also when we pivoted to surface mount for the first time, which was another real step up in our sort of manufacturing scalability. In 2020, when I had finished school and could finally focus on pedals full time, I took everything I'd learned so far, and with some manufacturability advice from my friend Hawker at Asheville Music Tools, we came up with version 4.5, which started shipping in 2021. Electronically, it's about the same as version 4, other than shifting the curves of the high and low EQ up about half an octave to reduce their interactivity with the mid control. This was a modification suggested by my friend Brian Sowers, and I think it really helps the pedal out quite a bit. While we were in there, we also added a voltage protection circuit to spare the power supply from any sort of external mishaps. I know there's been some discussion of the various versions over the years. Our friend Ian at Collector Emitter did a great video comparing some of them, which I'll link in the description. But in my opinion, 4.5 represents the definitive longsword. It's the culmination of all these tweaks and modifications and experiments over the years. And at this point, I would say it constitutes about 80% of the longswords that are out there in the world. So it's absolutely the definitive version, and we're super proud of it. Now, there is also the dagger. With Dagger V2 especially, we explored some kind of parallel universe takes on this circuit. And while we're super proud of that one, we did have to retire it due to poor sales. So I still think it's cool, but not everyone agreed. And so there you have it, the story of the longsword. So next, as promised, I'd like to talk about some sounds and settings. I'm going to share 3 of my personal favorite ways to use the longsword. If you like what you hear and want to explore in more depth, there are countless demos online, but I could probably be badgered into making a technical demo if there's enough demand for it. First is sort of a general starting point that I like to recommend to folks. For a big, wide open guitar sound, I like to basically point the low and high knobs at each other, and then season the rest to taste. If I run the drive fairly low and the boost near max, this provides 2 switchable gain settings on the fly, and at the higher gain settings, we can take advantage of the natural mid-focus of the boost channel, which keeps things defined when there's added low-frequency content from the EQ section. For this clip, I'm going to use my trusty Jazzmaster with a Robot Graves neck into a V4 with a matching cab that's loaded with Eminence Delta Pros and mic'd up with an OMA ribbon mic. Second, the longsword loves being combined with other pedals. Because it's very dynamic with a wide bandwidth, a boost up front tightens it up in a surprisingly amp-like fashion. This is especially nice with hot humbuckers. Here, I'm going to use it with a Tube Screamer style drive that Brad built. In this clip, I'm going to use the same amp and cab setup and the same mic, but I'm going to switch to my Les Paul Studio. Finally, I have to showcase this pedal on bass. If you like a Rat on bass, this can get into similar territory, but with enough low frequency coverage to really obviate the need for a clean blend. In this clip, I'm using my God City Craftsman bass with a GK 800RB and a Dually 2x15 with Eminence 3015 speakers. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. We've been incredibly humbled by the response that this pedal has received over the years. I think that op-amp drives are like pizza. There's not a lot of ingredients, but the variety is endless, and taste can be wildly subjective and personal. So we're grateful that 10 years later, folks are still enjoying this particular recipe. So thanks everyone, and here's to 10 more years. This is John, signing off.